California's Gold is produced in association with KCET Los Angeles and is seen statewide on California Public Television. This series is endorsed by the California Teachers Association, the California School Boards Association, and the California Library Association.
Hello everybody, I'm Huell, and here we are on the tracks. We're in the South Bay, just a couple of miles north of San Jose, and believe me, these are very historic tracks. Because if you head down just a couple of hundred feet, you'll be right in the middle of what used to be a very rich and colorful and exciting little community. Believe me, it was a happening place. Well, most of it's gone today, but some of it remains. And I can assure you that it is a wonderful chapter in California history. If you're interested in what we're talking about, what used to be down these tracks and what's still down there today, well, as always, you're invited to come on along with us as we head down the tracks in search of California's gold. Well, here we are walking right down the middle of the train tracks here. Our tour guide, one of them is Pat Anthony. Pat, tell us exactly where we are.
We are in Drawbridge, California, and we're walking on the main line of the Union Pacific Railroad.
Now, Drawbridge is not a community that most of us have even heard of, but at one time, this was a thriving community.
It really was. Well, this was basically a community. It wasn't a town, didn't have a fire chief, didn't have a mayor. It was just a community where people came to have fun. And there were over 100 permanent residents here in 1900. And on weekends, especially during hunting season, there would be around 600 people or so on this island.
Now, there were over 100 buildings, over 600 people here on a busy weekend.
Right.
So basically this was built up and down the tracks,
right,
out here in the middle of nowhere.
Right, because it's such a beautiful area, and if you think of how things were in 1900, the roads were poor, cars were rich man's toys. And so here's this beautiful area that people could get to because of the railroad.
Well, what would they do out here?
Oh, there was fishing and hunting. They used to say that when the ducks were disturbed, they would blacken the sky.
Really?
There were hundreds of thousands of ducks here.
So people came out here to duck hunt.
Right, basically.
And then just stayed
right,
for the whole weekend in what, these little houses?
Yeah, right. These down here, mostly duck clubs, individual vacation homes. People would come here mostly for vacationing. Like I said, there were some permanent residents here. People who work for the railroad, people who work for the hotels, and some artists and some fishermen lived here permanently. But most people came here to party and have a good time.
Was this kind of a bohemian community, or was this?
I really wouldn't call it that. Most of the people who came here were factory workers, middle-class professionals. We had some dentists. The mayor of San Francisco used to come here.
Just on vacation, just for long weekend.
Yeah, right. And they would come in the summertime. They would bring their wives and children, and a lot of them would just spend the summer here.
Boy, there wasn't much going on out here. I mean, these are some of the remaining houses out here. They would just come out here and stay in these.
Yeah.
These look very primitive. They would have been very primitive.
Right. If you think of it as like going camping. Now, this house right here wasn't really primitive in that a lady lived there full time. Mm-hmm. But if you look at some of the others are pretty small.
They're just little
shacks.
Little shacks.
They were built 1 or 2 rooms, and then they'd do lean-tos and add them on a little bit.
Look at these over here. Now they basically just lined, because when you look down the railroad tracks here, they would just line the railroad tracks.
They lined the railroad tracks. They all had a boardwalk to the railroad, so the railroad was Main Street Drawbridge. So we're walking down Main Street Drawbridge right now.
So there wasn't a street in the town, it was the tracks.
The tracks was Main Street.
And how would they get here? On the train?
They came mostly on the train. Some people, they would come by boat. In later years, they would come by car and would park up at a duck club and would walk in.
But when they were on a train back in, say, 1900, what would they do? Just ask the conductor to stop and let them off at Drawbridge?
Oh, no. At Drawbridge, there were 5 trains a day stopped at Drawbridge. There was a regular station, and there were 2 trains going each direction, and 1 train that was called the picnic train or the hunter's train, depending if it was summer or winter. And it spent the night.
So it would bring the picnickers out in the summertime.
In the summertime.
And the hunters out in the wintertime.
That's right.
Now, it's one thing to talk about Drawbridge. It's another thing to hear these stories from a guy who actually lived here. You lived here for a while, didn't you, Frank?
Well, during the summertime, yeah. When there was no school, I'd come up and stay with my grandfather.
And what was that experience like for you to actually come out here during the summer? You better be listening to these stories, Pat. These are first-hand stories.
Well, they dumped me off the train, and Grandpa picked me up. That's the other end down here. And, well, he used to take me hunting with him. He had blinds, and he dug ponds in the pickleweed. They would fill, regular salt water, and they'd shoot ducks there. Mm-hmm. And later on, when I was able to drive, we'd go to Milpitas, which was nothing then, and we'd pick up grain to feed the ducks, which was illegal. But Grandpa had money, so I figured he'd take care of me if I got caught.
Now, Frank, there were all kinds of boats out here. The fishermen and the hunters had their boats, and they were called
skull boats.
And they were just basic little
boats. You plaster mud in the front of them with tules, and you lay down on a boat and you paddle it by laying down, going right into the ducks where they were. And then my grandfather had kind of like an excursion boat. We could take a dozen people and a dog. And
now, what would you do on an excursion boat?
Just right around high tide in the sloughs. It was kind of interesting.
So people like to get out and kind of see it was like a sightseeing boat?
Yeah, it was like a sightseeing boat, and they just like to get out in the water.
Now, looking at this today, can you remember like something like this? I mean, would people have actually lived in a little place like that?
Yeah, sure. They were very attractive, and they looked nice, and they whitewashed them. They didn't paint them. Whitewash is cheaper. But of course, that's before they started sinking. You had to put mud sills in all the time to keep them from sinking into the mud.
So they were sinking even back then?
Oh, yeah. It's a terrific upkeep just to keep them going.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I'd watch them do that. I was too young to do anything.
Pat, this seems like a very unlikely place to establish a little town. You're laughing. I'm laughing. Nobody had a permit to build a building, they just go to it.
Like I said, it was here because people could get here, and it's, if you use your imagination a little bit, and these buildings were all up on boardwalks so that they could walk out, and like I said, outdoor people who come to Drawbridge were outdoor people who like to hunt and fish, and like I say, have a good time. There were 2 hotels here, so people would come out and play cards and sit in the bars and have a good time.
Well, I can imagine when the duck hunters were out here, a good time was had by all.
That's right. And they say sometimes they would party all night and then get up early in the morning and go out and shoot the ducks. And some people, if they didn't get up in the morning to go out duck hunting, they could always buy a duck from somebody.
Oh, they'd buy a duck from somebody else and take it back home and say that's what they had been doing.
Yeah.
That also was illegal. Oh. It wasn't illegal at first, but then they passed a law you couldn't sell ducks.
Yeah.
Now we're getting into a whole new little area up here. I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different kind of remains of the town here.
Yeah, and if you notice, basically all you can see here is the roofs, because this whole island is sinking.
So it's not that the grass is growing up, it's that the buildings are going down.
That's right, and the railroad that we're standing on has basically stayed the same place over 100 years, because the railroad comes in every 10, 15 years or so and builds it up as the island is sinking.
Now this is interesting. We have actually left the tracks for a minute because Pat, what do you want to show us, Pat?
I just show you the inside of a house. This house is a very interesting house. It was owned by the Bishops, who were from Bishop, California. And it's very interesting. Carpenters really love this house. And it's in good shape because they say it's got about twice as many shingles on it as the modern house.
Boy, this is something just getting to the Bishop house. And I tell you what, it might fall down on us while we're inside of it. I don't know how sturdy this thing is. Boy, this is kind of sad looking in here now. This has obviously seen better days, but you can tell from the way it's laid out that this used to be a pretty big cabin.
Yeah, pretty nice place. The family that owned this, you know, had money. They were from the Bishops that Bishop, California was named after. So they would come down and hunt here.
Boy, this also gives you a real opportunity to show just exactly what this is. This is just, what is this? This is just mud.
This is mud. We are in the wetlands. This is a marsh, and it's muddy. And as the tide comes in at high tide, it comes in. We're right now at low tide, and you can see how muddy it is. So we are out in the marsh.
So you mean when the high tide comes in, the water comes up a couple of feet?
Right.
Boy, this is how anybody ever built anything on this mud.
And
hard to believe.
That was a problem. You heard him talking about how his grandfather always gave him nails. It took a lot of work to keep these houses up.
I hate to tell you, I'm sinking too. This just goes, it just kind of sucks you right down.
Right, right.
Let's get back on the tracks.
Okay, sounds like a good
I'm afraid to hold on to the roof. I'm afraid it'll come off on me.
Sounds like watch the nails. I just stepped on a nail.
Frank, this is kind of nostalgic for you. This is the first time you've been back here in how many years?
Oh, it's a little over 20 years.
Really?
Yeah.
And when you were here 20 years ago, Drawbridge was already a ghost town.
It was already a ghost town, yeah. I didn't have much to show my kids. Because
so you brought your kids out here?
Yeah, I brought my kids out here. They were teenagers then.
Just to kind of show them where you used to hang out?
Yeah, because they heard me talk about it a lot.
Is it the kind of place that you do talk about a lot?
Yeah, it is, because we always had some good times here. Like at night, we'd entertain ourselves with playing put and take with beans or something, little games. And then we played cards. We had radios, no televisions in those days.
Did you feel like you were out in the middle of nowhere when you were here? Was that part of it, this kind of being an adventure out in the middle of the...
Well, well, yeah, you felt you're in the middle of nowhere because there's no stores around. You had to walk quite a distance to get your supplies. And gasoline was one of them for the motors. You had to carry 5 gallons of gas, you know.
Well, but you had electricity.
We had electricity, but it didn't come in until, I don't know, the early 30s. So when I first came here, it was kerosene lamps and kerosene stoves.
So there really was a sense of being out on this grand adventure, kind of camping out in these little shacks and sheds out in the middle of the marsh.
And then they had one telephone, and it was at the station house, locked up by the railroad. That was their telephone. Nobody could use it.
One phone?
One phone in the whole place. Nobody
that you couldn't use?
Nobody could use it. And so it didn't do us any good. And they always told me one thing you got to be very careful of is that you don't get hurt up here, because it's going to be awfully hard to get to a doctor. So we were very careful about that.
Now we got some more. This is the other end of town down here. Now this is where you lived.
I lived on this side. There's nothing here either.
So over on this side of the tracks, There's just one old, and that looks like almost like a barn over there.
Well, that's just ready to go now, and I don't know who owned that place, really. But when we get to the slough, I'll show you where we were. And this place was known as, this side of the tracks, is the French and the Portuguese. The Portuguese are over here. The guy was a contractor, I remember.
So wait a minute, the French were over here.
French were over here.
Portuguese were over there.
Over here, yeah.
And where was everybody else?
Up there.
So the town was kind of divided up?
Oh, definitely, very definitely.
They wouldn't let their kids come down here.
We
It's
had-
a rough part of town.
Oh, this was the rough part of Drawbridge down here.
We had North Drawbridge and South Drawbridge, and there was two definite communities, depending on who you talk to. The good guys lived in the north, and the bad guys lived in the south.
What do you mean
Now
the
that
good
must-
guys and the bad
Now
guys?
that must have been the good guy. Must have been a northerner talking.
I'm one of the
Actually,
You're one of the bad
bad,
guys.
yeah, I'm one of the bad guys.
some people said no, that wasn't what it was. There were good folks all around.
So wait a minute, Drawbridge there was a, this is north,
No, this is South
this
Drawbridge.
is South Drawbridge, and then
that's-
just the whole town just went a mile
Yeah.
or less.
And they didn't like each other. They pretended each other didn't exist. Some people said, well, no, that wasn't true. Good people lived on both ends of town.
Uh-huh.
And other people said, well, no, it was the Catholics lived in the south and the Protestants lived in the north.
Oh, good
well, I've
grief.
talked to Catholics all over the island. Well, most of these, like he said, were Portuguese and
French.
and so we had Catholics all over the island. What I really think it is, my own personal opinion is, not that it's the good guys and the bad guys, but it was the permanent residents against the temporary residents.
Oh, so the hotels were down
The
there.
hotels were down there, the duck clubs were down there, and
One was here.
There was a hotel here too?
Yeah, the Hunter's Lodge.
Hunter's home was here.
So did they have actual places where the duck hunters stayed when they came?
Yes.
Little hotels?
Two hotels, Sprung Hotel and Hunter's Home. And so
they could get their meals prepared,
right.
and they wouldn't have to have a house. They could just come out on the
Right,
train,
out on the train and stay in the
hunt ducks, and stay in the hotel.
And
Yeah.
a duck meal was 35 cents.
Fresh duck too.
Yeah, and what was it? A liter of beer was 35 cents
Yeah.
or 30 cents.
And they
This
had-
is during Prohibition,
And
you
during
know.
Prohibition, oh yeah, during Prohibition, the bars stayed open.
Now why does that not surprise me? I think everything was.
We're out in the middle of nowhere, of course. But you could get a drink anywhere. But that was one of the stories of the rough things, is people came out here during Prohibition, and Mrs. Sprung made her homebrew beer, and
Oh, so they were making beer out here.
Sure,
Good
yeah,
beer.
and selling it.
good beer.
Yeah, it was good. I remember because it gave me a drink of it. I could still remember what it tastes like.
Yeah.
Now we're getting to a very interesting part of the story, because a lot of the pictures I've seen of the heyday of Drawbridge show people swimming. And I can't believe that people used to swim in this water.
It was very popular with my whole family. We'd string a large rope across from one building to another, and us kids would hang on the rope. And then we had life preservers, Titanic style, made out of big cork things. And we'd swim around, and the water was pretty clean then. I mean, you know, nobody seemed to worry about it. They had crabs, little crabs, and you'd bite your feet. And then they had leopard shark and other fish around here.
Oh
that
my
they could fish.
gosh.
So I don't know what they have now.
But there are a lot of pictures, Pat, of people actually looking like they're having fun in this water.
And if you notice how muddy the water was, I was talking to one drawbridger, and she said after they got home from swimming, that her mother always had a nice warm tub ready for them, because all the kids had to have a bath when they got out, because they were all muddy from swimming in the water, and so the kids had the nice warm bath after they got out of the
What was
water.
the appeal of swimming in this stuff?
Well, if you think of how hot it gets in August, and the kids were usually here in August, and it's pretty warm, and so and kids have swam in sloughs and rivers and lakes for a long time. So that was just a place to cool off.
Was the water clean in the sense of it wasn't really polluted or anything?
No,
it was just dirty.
Yeah, it was just, well, it wasn't too
Muddy.
dirty. Yeah, but just like regular seawater. Yeah, before any pollution was here.
And that brings to mind that all these houses here didn't have any indoor plumbing either.
No, they had outhouses, and the outhouses were out by the sloughs. And people say, yuck. But if you think people were using outhouses in town,
Yeah.
and these outhouses got swept clean twice a day by the tide. So it was a pretty easy maintenance outhouse out here.
And it wasn't a problem swimming in the water?
No, the pollution came when the canneries and the people came, and we had 1 million people's worth of sewage coming down here. Now in the 50s, I wouldn't swim in the water because we had raw sewage from the sewage plant coming down here in the 50s.
But in the heyday of Drawbridge.
Back in 1900, no. If you think of, a couple of hundred and all this water and how it sweeps out, pollution was not a problem there. It was in later days when big population came that the pollution became a problem.
All right, we've reached kind of a historic place right here because this is the city limits right here. Right here on the bridge. And we're not going to walk down this bridge because trains still use this.
That's right.
On a regular basis.
Right, and back on the island you have a place to dive to, but I really wouldn't want to go in that muddy water right now.
Did the kids walk on the bridges?
Oh yeah, this was a trestle, because it was open every so many inches. So you couldn't look down, you looked straight ahead and walk across it so that you wouldn't get caught.
Was there literally a drawbridge here? Is that how it got its name?
It wasn't a drawbridge because it would swing around. It would go to 45-degree angle like that.
But it was a bridge that opened up.
This bridge, both bridges at the end of town were swing bridges. Rather than going up and down, they were swing bridges. And if you see the pilings out in the slough, those were the brakes.
Yes.
So the
bridges would open up to those pilings.
Swing out to the pilings and stop, and then the boats could go through.
There were wooden walks that went out to each of these shacks. And the Southern Pacific charged $6 a year taxes on it, something like that. And Grandpa used to collect the taxes. And if the people didn't pay, he cut the walk off. And not 1 or 2 feet, but 10 feet. If you want to get to your shack, you had to go either through the mud or the high water.
Or pay your taxes.
And
then what would he do, build them back, or did you have to build them back?
Just leave them that way. It was up to the people to build it back themselves.
And now it's time for another chapter, to talk about another chapter in the history of Drawbridge. Introduce yourself to everybody.
Hi, my name is Carmen Leong, and I'm an outdoor recreation planner at the Don Edwards Refuge.
And we have been seeing you kind of in the background as we were listening to stories from Pat and Frank. You're here to kind of bring us up to speed on what all of this area is now.
Right, this area is protected by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it is a very important habitat for waterfowl and shorebirds. Our refuge protects millions and millions of birds that fly through every winter and every spring as they migrate north and south depending on the weather.
Now, are these technically classified as wetlands or marshes, or what are they called?
It's both. It's a marsh, salt marsh, and it's also a wetland.
And this represents just a tiny, tiny part of the wetlands that used to be here in the Bay Area.
That's correct. There has been a dramatic loss of wetlands all over the state of California, and only 15% of wetlands are left. So it's very important for the wildlife out here.
So this is all as far as we can see in this direction, all the way down, and then all the way out here. This is all now protected for birds, for what, fish? A lot of fish
birds,
in there?
Fish, but mostly waterfowl, but there's also a lot of fish. There's also a lot of invertebrates that you don't see in the water and in the sloughs that lots of wildlife eat, not just birds, but mammals as well.
So this is a nice area. Birds like it here.
Oh, they sure do. Yep.
Well, as we close, I guess the obvious question is, Pat, what happened to Drawbridge? Why is it a ghost town today?
Well, I like to call Drawbridge a microcosm of what's happened to the entire bay. It was a beautiful rural area, and the people came. And after the Depression, the war came, people came, and during the 50s, Drawbridge was not a wonderful place.
Why?
Because we had a sewage plant right down the way. We had raw sewage coming through here. We had disposal from the canneries, and so we had the refuge from the canneries coming through here. So this was a very smelly, yucky place.
And also it
50s.
probably got a little out of date too.
Right.
People, the new generation was a little hipper, and this
they
was
had
kind of dull out
That's
here.
right. They had more options than the earlier generation did. And these buildings, you notice back there, took a lot of upkeep. So it was a combination of all of those things, that it wasn't a nice place and the buildings took upkeep, so people would just went other places.
And it just kind of has been falling apart to the
Ever
point now where there are just a few buildings left. And they're sinking.
And they're sinking in the mud, right.
Well, the buildings are sinking, but the stories are not. The stories are still very much afloat, thanks to you. Thank you, Pat.
You're welcome.
And of course to Frank, who shared these wonderful, wonderful stories. How do you feel coming back?
Well, I feel good, but if I didn't have these pictures, well, it wouldn't mean that much to me.
Yeah, because
But,
it's, and really, that's why you're here. You're with the National Refuge, and you work at the Visitor Center, and you came for what reason today?
I came to finally see it. I started volunteering at the Refuge when Pat was still doing her tours, and then they stopped them. Haven't had a chance to get out here, and really wanted to get a chance
So
to get
you
a
wanted
feel
to
for
see the
history.
place for yourself.
I've lived in the Bay Area for 30 years, and for a long time never knew there was a place like this. So,
Yeah.
And it's a really unique place in our history.
Which brings to mind this other fella right here who's kind of been lurking in the background with a cell phone up to his ear. Mike, you're from Union Pacific Railroad.
That's right.
And this is still very much an active
Oh, absolutely.
train route coming
Yep.
through here.
It's part of our coastline, which connects the Bay Area to Southern California, and both freights and passenger trains pass through here frequently every day.
And you were having that cell phone up to make sure there weren't any trains coming down the track.
Absolutely, because there isn't a lot of room to get away from the trains here.
And wonder what people think, the passengers on those trains think, when they're, barreling down this track and they happen to look out and see these dilapidated old wooden houses sinking into the mud.
Oh, I'm sure 99% of them have no idea what they're looking at, and they wouldn't have any reason to. I mean, it's not a well-known area, so we hope maybe it'll intrigue a few of them, but it just looks like old abandoned buildings to most of them.
Kind of sad in a way, Pat.
Yeah, it is kind of sad, and you could look at it as old dilapidated buildings that's sinking in the mud, or can use a little bit of imagination and a little bit of memory and think about how it was and have all the busy people down there having a good time and enjoying themselves. And that's the way I prefer to remember it, is the way it was rather than the way it is now.